The Vampire King's termination letter arrived in Elena's inbox at exactly 9 a.m. Monday. But the blood test results waiting in her apartment would prove that walking away from him was no longer an option. What started as a professional firing had become a biological binding neither of them could break. Elena Martinez stared at the computer screen in her cramped studio apartment, the cursor blinking mockingly in the empty subject line of what would become her 100th job application this week. The termination email from Blackthorn Industries still sat in her inbox like a digital wound that refused to heal, its timestamp burned into her memory. Monday, 9:00 a.m. Exactly. 3 years of 12-hour days, 3 years of anticipating Lucian Blackthorn's needs before he voiced them, 3 years of navigating the Byzantine politics of Seattle's most powerful corporation, all reduced to a single paragraph of corporate speak and a severance check that felt more like blood money. The glass surface of her coffee table reflected her pale face back at her, and she noticed for the first time how hollow her cheeks had become, how dark the circles under her brown eyes appeared. The stress was eating her alive from the inside out, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in her world, something that went beyond mere unemployment. The rain hammered against her windows with the relentless intensity that only Seattle could deliver, each droplet like a tiny fist beating against the glass, demanding entry into her already fractured sanctuary. Elena pulled her oversized sweater tighter around her shoulders, but the chill seemed to come from within, a cold that no amount of fabric could chase away. Her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, and she knew without looking that it would be another message from Sophia Chen, her best friend since college, probably containing another job listing or an invitation to drown her sorrows in wine. The apartment felt smaller today, the walls pressing in with each passing hour, and she found herself remembering the vast expanse of the Blackthorn Industries executive floor, how the entire city had spread out below them like a kingdom waiting to be conquered. She had felt powerful there, important, like she was part of something larger than herself, even if she had never quite understood what that something was. 30 floors above the Seattle streets, Lucian Blackthorn stood motionless behind the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, watching the afternoon light fade into the gray twilight that perpetually shrouded the Pacific Northwest. His reflection was absent from the glass, a detail that would have terrified any human observer. But the office remained empty except for his solitary figure. The mahogany desk behind him bore fresh cracks where his fingers had gripped too tightly during the morning conference call with the European Council, their voices echoing through encrypted channels with barely concealed threats and ancient disapproval. 800 years of existence had taught him patience, had shown him how to mask emotion behind a facade of corporate efficiency, but the past week had tested even his supernatural control. The scent of Elena's perfume still lingered in the office despite the industrial air filtration system, a subtle jasmine and vanilla blend that had become as familiar to him as the rhythm of his own unnecessary breathing. The leather chair where Elena used to sit during their evening strategy sessions remained pushed back from the conference table at precisely the angle she had left it, and Lucian found his enhanced senses drawing him back to that moment again and again, replaying the memory of Friday night when professional boundaries had dissolved like sugar in rain. She had been working late again, her dedication to the quarterly reports bordering on obsessive, her dark hair falling across her face as she bent over spreadsheets that detailed acquisitions and mergers, hiding supernatural territory disputes. The jasmine scent had been stronger that night, mixed with the metallic tang of stress and something else, something that had made his dormant predatory instincts stir with interest rather than hunger. When she had looked up at him with those warm brown eyes, exhaustion and determination warring in her expression, something had shifted between them. Some invisible barrier had cracked, and before either of them could think or reason or remember why it was impossible, his lips had been on hers and her fingers had been threading through his dark hair, and 3 years of careful professional distance had evaporated in the space of a heartbeat. The buzzer at Elena's apartment door cut through her brooding like a blade, sharp and insistent. Sophia Chen stood in the hallway holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing an expression of barely contained worry, her medical training making her automatically catalog the changes in Elena's appearance with clinical precision. Elena's skin had taken on an almost translucent quality, and there was something different about the way she moved, a languid grace that seemed at odds with her usual efficient energy. Sophia pushed past her friend into the small living space, setting the coffee on the kitchen counter, and immediately beginning the lecture that Elena had been expecting since Monday's termination news broke. The words washed over her like background noise, something about toxic work environments and legal options and the importance of self-care. But Elena found her attention drifting to the strange sensations that had been plaguing her for days. Food tasted different now, metallic and overwhelming, and bright lights made her eyes water in ways that sunglasses couldn't fix. Sleep came in fragments filled with dreams that felt more like memories, images of ancient stone corridors and candlelit ceremonies that left her waking with the taste of copper in her mouth. Sophia's voice grew sharper, cutting through Elena's distraction with the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. The concern in her friend's dark eyes was genuine, born from years of friendship that had survived college roommate disputes and career changes, and the general chaos of navigating adulthood in an expensive city. Elena tried to focus on the conversation, tried to engage with Sophia's suggestions about unemployment benefits and networking events, but her mind kept wandering back to Lucian's office, to the way his gray eyes had seemed to glow in the dim light, to the impossible strength in his hands when he had pulled her against him. There had been something otherworldly about that moment, something that defied rational explanation, and now every part of her body seemed to be rebelling against the mundane reality of job searches and apartment rent and the ordinary concerns that had defined her existence before Friday night. Miles away in his private study, Lucian stood before an ornate mirror that had been crafted in Prague during the 14th century, its silver surface reflecting only the room behind him, never his own form. The walls around him displayed treaties written in Latin and languages that predated recorded history, agreements between supernatural courts that had shaped the hidden politics of the world for millennia. His phone buzzed with encrypted messages from vampire lords across 3 continents, their digital communications layered with enough security protocols to baffle government intelligence agencies. The European Council had moved faster than he had anticipated, their spy networks already confirming what Lucian had hoped to keep hidden for at least another week. Lady Morgana's message was particularly direct in its elegant threat, her words chosen with the precision of someone who had spent 1,000 years perfecting the art of diplomatic menace. The ancient laws were clear on this matter, had been codified in blood and ritual long before humans had learned to work iron, and every vampire in his territory knew the price of defying the old courts. Elena found herself standing at her bathroom mirror, studying her reflection with growing unease. The face that looked back at her was familiar but somehow different, as if someone had adjusted the contrast and saturation of a photograph. Her brown eyes seemed larger, more luminous, and there was a subtle sharpness to her features that hadn't been there a week ago. When she ran her tongue across her teeth, she could swear they felt different, slightly more pointed than they should be, though the mirror showed nothing unusual. The dizziness that had been plaguing her for days intensified as she leaned closer to the glass, and she gripped the sink for support, her knuckles going white with the force of her grip. The porcelain cracked under her fingers, a spiderweb of fractures spreading from where she touched, and she jerked her hands back in shock. She had always been careful with her strength, had always been the type of person who opened jars for other people rather than asking for help, but this was different. This was impossible. Sophia's medical training kicked in as she watched Elena sway on her feet, the pallor and fatigue combining with other symptoms that were beginning to form a pattern in her mind. The suggestion of a doctor visit met with resistance that surprised both women, Elena's usual pragmatism replaced by an inexplicable reluctance to submit to medical examination. The conversation grew heated as Sophia pressed her case, professional concern overriding social politeness, and Elena found herself defending her decision with arguments that made no logical sense even to her own ears. Something deep in her mind whispered warnings about blood tests and medical records, about the importance of keeping certain secrets hidden, though she had no idea where such thoughts were coming from. The jasmine perfume she had been wearing for years suddenly seemed too strong, too sweet, and she had an overwhelming urge to wash it off, to replace it with something darker and more mysterious. The city lights began to flicker on as evening approached, and Lucien felt the familiar stirring in his blood that came with sunset. The hunger that had defined his existence for 8 centuries remained dormant, satisfied by the carefully managed feeding schedule that his position required. But tonight brought a different kind of appetite, a restlessness that had nothing to do with blood and everything to do with the woman whose scent still haunted his office. The European Council's ultimatum would arrive soon, delivered through channels that bypassed human postal systems entirely, and he knew that his carefully constructed world of corporate power and supernatural politics was about to collide in ways that would change everything. The ancient laws that governed vampire society had been written in an age when humans were cattle and secrecy was maintained through fear rather than careful manipulation. But the modern world demanded subtlety that his ancestors had never needed to master. Elena's phone rang as she stood in her kitchen, trying to force down a dinner that tasted like ash and metal. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, and something in her newly heightened intuition warned her not to answer. The voicemail that followed was brief and professional, a law firm requesting her presence for a reading of documents related to her recent employment termination, but there was something in the lawyer's tone that made her skin crawl. Sophia had finally left after extracting a promise that Elena would see a doctor by the end of the week, but the apartment felt even emptier in her absence, filled with shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. The rain continued its assault on the windows, and Elena found herself drawn to the glass, pressing her palm against the cool surface and feeling the vibrations of each droplet with unnatural clarity. Sleep came fitfully that night, bringing dreams that felt like glimpses into someone else's memories. Stone corridors lit by torches, the sound of ceremonial chanting in languages she didn't recognize, the taste of wine that was too dark and too rich to be entirely grape. In the dreams, she wore dresses of midnight blue silk and jewelry that caught torchlight like captured starfire, and there were always eyes watching her from the shadows, gray eyes that held the weight of centuries and the promise of forever. She woke several times gasping, her skin damp with perspiration that smelled wrong, metallic and sharp, but each time she drifted back into the strange visions that seemed to be calling her toward some inevitable destiny. When morning finally arrived, gray and rain-soaked through her windows, Elena felt as if she had lived several lifetimes in the space of a single night, and the ordinary concerns of unemployment and apartment rent seemed suddenly insignificant compared to the vast changes that were reshaping her from within. Elena's hands trembled as she held the plastic test, the 2 pink lines staring back at her with undeniable clarity that made her legs weak enough to sink onto the cold bathroom tiles. The digital confirmation from Dr. Sarah Chen's office had arrived via secure portal just minutes before, but seeing the clinical language spelled out in medical terms somehow made it more real and more impossible at the same time. Her mind raced through the timeline, calculating dates with the precision that had made her such an effective executive assistant. And every calculation led back to that Friday night in Lucian's office when professional boundaries had dissolved like morning mist. The jasmine perfume she had worn that night now seemed like a different person's choice, a relic from a life that was rapidly becoming unrecognizable, and she found herself pressing her palm against her still flat stomach with a mixture of wonder and terror that threatened to overwhelm her already fragmented sense of reality. The medical office had been sterile and bright, fluorescent lights that made Elena's newly sensitive eyes water behind the designer sunglasses she had taken to wearing constantly. Dr. Sarah Chen had been Sophia's recommendation, a gynecologist with an impeccable reputation and the kind of no-nonsense bedside manner that usually put Elena at ease. But today, every surface in the examination room had seemed to gleam with hostile brightness. The initial consultation had been routine until Elena began describing the symptoms that had been plaguing her since Monday morning, the heightened senses that made city traffic sound like a symphony of chaos, the way sunlight now felt like tiny needles against her skin, the cravings for red meat so rare it was practically raw. Dr. Chen's professional composure had wavered slightly as she scribbled notes, her pen scratching against the prescription pad with unusual force, as Elena detailed how her sense of smell had become so acute that she could identify individual perfumes from 3 floors away. The blood work results that Dr. Chen ordered would take 48 hours to process, but the physician's concerned expression suggested that Elena's unusual symptoms were only the beginning of a much larger mystery. The elevated white cell count was concerning enough on its own, but combined with other markers that Dr. Chen described as anomalous without elaborating further, Elena's medical profile was beginning to resemble something out of a science fiction novel rather than a routine pregnancy. The doctor's questions had grown more probing as the appointment progressed, inquiries about family medical history and recent travel and exposure to unusual substances that Elena couldn't answer with anything approaching completeness. How could she explain that her most significant recent exposure had been to Lucian Blackthorne himself, to the intoxicating scent that seemed to cling to his skin and the impossible strength in his hands when he had pulled her close? Across the city, in the climate-controlled silence of his penthouse office, Lucian Blackthorne felt something stirring in his bloodline that defied 8 centuries of experience. The sensation had begun as a whisper at the edge of his consciousness on Monday morning, growing stronger each day until it became an insistent pull that made concentration nearly impossible. Ancient magic that had been dormant since his transformation in the 13th century was awakening, responding to some catalyst that his rational mind couldn't identify, but his supernatural instincts recognized with growing certainty. The feeling was unlike anything in his considerable experience, not the familiar hunger for blood or the territorial awareness that came with his position as vampire king, but something deeper and more primal that seemed to resonate from the very core of his being. The sensation intensified as Friday afternoon faded into evening, becoming so powerful that Lucian found himself rising from his desk and moving toward the windows without conscious decision. The city spread out below him like a living map, millions of human hearts beating in rhythms he could sense if he concentrated, but tonight, one pulse called to him above all others. Elena's heartbeat, rapid and strong and somehow different from the steady rhythm he had grown accustomed to sensing during their 3 years of professional proximity, drew his attention like a beacon in the supernatural darkness. The changes in her scent that he had noticed during their last encounter were becoming more pronounced, reaching him even across the miles that separated them, and every instinct he possessed was screaming that something fundamental had shifted in the delicate balance of power that governed his carefully constructed world. Elena's apartment had become a fortress of drawn blinds and dimmed lights, the brightness of the outside world too harsh for her transformed senses to tolerate. The positive pregnancy test lay on her coffee table, like evidence of some impossible crime, surrounded by the detritus of her research into the Blackthorne family history that had consumed her entire Friday evening. What had started as idle curiosity about her former employer had become an obsessive dive into newspaper archives and public records that painted a picture too strange to believe and too detailed to dismiss. The Blackthorne name appeared in Seattle business records dating back over a century, always associated with the same company, always linked to men who bore an uncanny resemblance to the Lucian she knew, and always accompanied by the kind of wealth and influence that transcended normal human limitations. The leather-bound journal had been the key to everything, a book she had discovered quite by accident in the box of personal items that security had packed from her desk. Hidden beneath legal documents and office supplies, the journal was bound in what looked like ancient leather and secured with a clasp that had taken her several minutes to figure out. The pages inside were filled with handwriting in multiple languages, some she recognized as Latin and others that looked like nothing she had ever seen, but interspersed throughout were passages in English written in a familiar hand. Lucian's handwriting, she realized with growing amazement, but entries dated from decades and centuries before his birth was even possible. The earliest entry she could decipher was dated 1205 and described a transformation that had taken place in a monastery somewhere in what was now Romania, a ritual involving blood and ancient words that had granted immortal life at the cost of humanity. Reading the journal felt like archaeology of the impossible, each page revealing layers of history that rewrote everything Elena thought she knew about the man who had been her employer, and, for one night, something much more intimate. The entries chronicled centuries of existence, describing the rise and fall of kingdoms, the secret politics of supernatural courts, and the gradual accumulation of power and wealth that had eventually led to the creation of Blackthorn Industries. Lucian's voice came through clearly in the more recent entries, his thoughts on the modern world and the challenges of maintaining secrecy in an age of digital surveillance and social media, creating a portrait of someone struggling to adapt ancient instincts to contemporary realities. The final entries, written in the weeks before Elena's termination, revealed a growing awareness of threats from European vampire courts and the dangerous attention that his relationship with a human employee was beginning to attract. The implications of what she was reading hit Elena like physical blows, each revelation reshaping her understanding of not just Lucian's nature, but her own situation. The medical symptoms that had been puzzling Dr. Chen suddenly made perfect sense in the context of what the journal revealed about vampire reproduction, a subject that Lucian had researched extensively and documented with clinical precision. Vampire human offspring were theoretically possible, according to sources that dated back to medieval monasteries and Renaissance alchemists, but historically such pregnancies had been fatal to the human mothers. The supernatural physiology required to sustain a vampire child was incompatible with human biology, creating a cascade of changes that typically resulted in death within weeks of conception. Elena's hand moved instinctively to her stomach as she read passage after passage describing the tragic history of vampire human reproduction, each account more horrifying than the last. The few documented cases from previous centuries had all ended the same way, with human mothers dying in agony as their bodies failed to adapt to the supernatural demands of their pregnancies. But there were hints in the older texts of exceptions, rare cases where human mothers possessed some latent magical heritage that allowed them to survive the transformation process long enough to give birth. These accounts were fragmentary and often contradictory, written by observers who understood little of what they were witnessing, but they offered a glimmer of hope in an otherwise hopeless situation. The journal's final entries revealed Lucian's growing awareness of Elena's condition even before she knew about it herself, his supernatural senses allowing him to detect the changes in her scent and heartbeat that indicated pregnancy. His decision to terminate her employment had been motivated not by callousness, but by desperation, a futile attempt to protect her from the supernatural politics that would inevitably consume them both once the pregnancy became known to the vampire courts. The European Council's intelligence network was extensive and ruthless, capable of detecting threats to vampire secrecy with efficiency that would have impressed government agencies, and a pregnant human carrying a vampire king's child represented exactly the kind of exposure risk that ancient laws were designed to prevent. Elena closed the journal and leaned back against her couch cushions, her mind reeling from the weight of what she had discovered. The man she had worked for, respected, and ultimately given herself to was not just powerful or wealthy or influential in ways she had never fully understood. He was something that shouldn't exist in the modern world, a creature from humanity's darkest myths made real, and walking among unsuspecting humans with the confidence of someone who had mastered the art of hiding in plain sight. The child growing inside her was not just unexpected or inconvenient, or complicated in the ways that normal pregnancies could be. It was unprecedented, dangerous, and potentially fatal, representing a collision between two worlds that had spent centuries learning to coexist through careful separation and mutual ignorance. The physical changes that had been frightening her all week suddenly made sense in the context of what the journal revealed about supernatural transformation. Her heightened senses, her aversion to sunlight, her cravings for raw meat, all were signs that her human physiology was attempting to adapt to the demands of carrying a vampire child. The process was dangerous and unpredictable, according to the historical accounts, but it was also the only hope she had of surviving what was happening to her. The alternative, which the journal described in clinical detail, was a slow death, as her body failed to provide what her supernatural child needed to develop properly. As midnight approached, Elena felt the pull that the journal had described, the growing connection between vampire parent and developing child that transcended normal human understanding of pregnancy. Somewhere across the city, she could sense Lucian's presence like a warm light in the darkness, his supernatural nature calling to something deep inside her that was awakening in response to their shared connection. The pregnancy was creating bonds between them that went beyond the physical, magical links that would grow stronger as their child developed, and Elena realized with a mixture of terror and wonder that her transformation into something more than human had only just begun. The rain that had been Seattle's constant companion all week continued to fall against her windows, each droplet catching the streetlight in ways that her enhanced vision could perceive with startling clarity. Elena pressed her palm against the cool glass and felt the vibrations of each impact, her supernatural senses revealing layers of reality that had been invisible to her human perception just days before. The world was larger and stranger and more dangerous than she had ever imagined, filled with creatures and politics and ancient laws that operated in shadows cast by humanity's willful ignorance. She was carrying the first vampire heir born in over 3 centuries, a child whose existence would reshape the supernatural world in ways that neither she nor Lucian could fully predict, and the discovery filled her with equal parts terror and fierce protectiveness that surprised her with its intensity. Elena's keycard still worked despite her termination, a oversight in Blackthorn Industries' usually flawless security protocols that allowed her to slip through the marble lobby at 11:30 on Saturday night, when the building stood empty except for skeletal security staff who recognized her face and waved her through without question. Her enhanced senses guided her through the darkened corridors with supernatural precision, every footstep echoing through halls that had once felt like home, but now seemed foreign and threatening in ways that had nothing to do with the late hour or her unauthorized presence. The elevator ride to the penthouse floor felt endless, each floor marker lighting up with agonizing slowness, while her heart hammered against her ribs with a rhythm that seemed to synchronize with some distant pulse she could feel but not identify. The leather journal clutched in her hands felt warm against her palms, its ancient pages filled with revelations that had shattered her understanding of reality and left her floating in a sea of impossibilities that demanded confrontation rather than acceptance. The executive floor was bathed in the pale glow of emergency lighting, shadows stretching across Persian rugs, and original artwork that she had admired during countless late nights spent managing Lucian's impossibly complex schedule. Her feet carried her toward his office with the certainty of muscle memory, past conference rooms where she had taken minutes for meetings that she now realized had involved supernatural politics disguised as corporate strategy sessions, past the assistant station where she had spent 3 years, believing she understood the nature of her employer and her own place in his carefully constructed world. The double doors to Lucian's office stood slightly ajar, spilling golden light into the corridor in a way that suggested he had been expecting her arrival, and Elena felt her supernatural senses prickle with awareness of his presence, even before she pushed the doors open and stepped into the space that had become the epicenter of her transformation from ordinary human to something unprecedented and dangerous. Lucian stood with his back to the door, silhouetted against the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of Seattle's glittering skyline, and Elena could see his reflection absent from the glass surface in a way that confirmed everything the journal had revealed about his true nature. His stillness was absolute, the kind of motionless waiting that only immortal creatures could achieve, but she could sense the tension radiating from his form like heat from a forge. When he finally turned to face her, his gray eyes held centuries of weariness, and a pain so deep that her newly awakened empathic abilities recoiled from the intensity of his emotional state. The corporate mask he had worn for 3 years had been stripped away completely, revealing features that were sharper and more predatory than human physiology should allow, and Elena realized with a shock that she was seeing his true face for the first time since their relationship had moved beyond the boundaries of employer and employee. The confrontation erupted between them like lightning striking dry tinder, Elena's accusations pouring forth in a torrent of anger and betrayal that made her voice ring through the office with supernatural resonance. She threw the journal onto his desk with enough force to crack the mahogany surface, the ancient leather binding falling open to reveal pages covered in his distinctive handwriting across multiple centuries of existence. Her words cut through the space between them like blades, each sentence sharp with the pain of discovering that everything she had believed about their relationship had been built on lies and careful omissions. The termination letter, the clinical dismissal, the complete absence of explanation or acknowledgement of what had passed between them. All of it felt like deliberate cruelty now that she understood the supernatural context that had driven his decisions. How dare he make choices about her life without her knowledge? How dare he treat her like a problem to be solved rather than a person deserving of truth and agency in determining her own fate? Lucian's carefully maintained control began to fracture under the assault of her righteous fury, his immortal composure cracking to reveal emotions that he had spent centuries learning to suppress. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried the weight of ancient authority and desperate vulnerability in equal measure, each word chosen with the precision of someone accustomed to diplomatic negotiations where a single misstatement could trigger wars. He explained the impossible situation that her pregnancy had created, the way vampire politics operated according to laws that predated most human civilizations and showed no mercy for those who violated their fundamental principles. The European Council had already begun moving against him, their spy networks reporting back to ancient courts that viewed human-vampire relationships as abominations to be eliminated with extreme prejudice. Elena's existence as his pregnant human lover made her not just a liability, but a weapon that rival factions could use to destroy everything he had built over 8 centuries of careful political maneuvering. The termination letter had been his attempt to create distance between them, a desperate gambit to protect her by severing their professional connection before the supernatural world could target her as leverage against his position as vampire king. But the pregnancy had rendered such protection meaningless, creating bonds between them that transcended employment contracts and corporate hierarchies in ways that ancient magic recognized regardless of human legal documents. Elena listened to his explanation with growing horror as she realized that her firing had actually made the situation worse, eliminating the legitimate cover story that might have allowed them to navigate the crisis with some hope of survival. Now she was simply an unemployed human carrying the child of a vampire king, with no protection beyond Lucian's personal power and no legal framework that could shield her from supernatural justice. The revelation of the blood bond forming between them hit Elena like a physical blow, her enhanced senses suddenly able to perceive the magical connections that were strengthening with each passing day of her pregnancy. Lucian's explanation of vampire reproduction revealed that their child was creating unprecedented links between parent and carrier, supernatural pathways that would allow each of them to sense the other's emotional and physical state across any distance. Her developing abilities were side effects of this bonding process, her human physiology adapting to accommodate magical energies that had never been designed to flow through mortal vessels. The heightened senses, the aversion to sunlight, the cravings for raw meat, all were symptoms of a transformation that was rewriting her cellular structure to support their supernatural child's development and survival. Elena pressed her palm against her stomach as Lucian described the implications of what was happening to her body, feeling for the first time a faint flutter of movement that seemed too early for normal pregnancy, but made perfect sense in the context of vampire development timelines. Their child was growing faster than human gestation would allow, fed by supernatural energies that were transforming Elena into something that was neither fully human nor completely vampire, but existed in some undefined space between the two states. The process was dangerous and unpredictable, with no historical precedents to guide them through the challenges that lay ahead. But it was also their only hope for survival, in a world where vampire law demanded death for anyone who threatened the secrecy that protected their species from human discovery and persecution. The temperature in the office began to drop with supernatural suddenness, frost forming on the windows despite the building's climate control system, and Elena's enhanced senses screamed warnings about approaching danger even before the first figures materialized from shadows that seemed deeper and more substantial than physics should allow. Lady Morgana Ashford emerged from darkness like a queen stepping from her throne room, her ancient presence filling the space with an authority that made Elena's newly awakened supernatural instincts recoil in terror. Two other council members flanked her, their faces bearing the timeless beauty and casual cruelty that marked creatures who had spent centuries viewing humans as cattle rather than equals. The air itself seemed to thicken with their presence, magical energies pressing against Elena's consciousness with enough force to make her stagger backward until she found herself pressed against Lucian's solid form. Lady Morgana's voice carried the refined accent of European nobility, mixed with something far older and more dangerous, each word precisely articulated with the confidence of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. Her appearance was flawless in the way that only supernatural enhancement could achieve. Dark hair swept back in an elegant chignon that accentuated features that belonged on Renaissance sculptures rather than living faces. The silk dress she wore was midnight blue and probably cost more than Elena's annual salary, but it was her eyes that truly marked her as something other than human, pale blue orbs that held the accumulated wisdom and cruelty of 1,000 years spent manipulating lesser beings for her own entertainment. When her gaze fixed on Elena, the intensity of her attention felt like being examined by a predator, deciding whether its prey was worth the effort of a clean kill. The confrontation between Lucian and the Vampire Council played out like a chess match between masters who had been studying each other's strategies for centuries, each statement loaded with implications that extended far beyond their surface meaning. Morgana's presence in his office represented a declaration of war disguised as a diplomatic mission, her very willingness to travel from Europe to confront him personally, indicating that the situation had escalated beyond the point where normal political channels could provide resolution. The ancient laws she cited were older than most human civilizations, codified in blood and ritual during eras when vampire secrecy was maintained through fear rather than careful manipulation of modern institutions. Elena found herself caught in the center of a supernatural power struggle that reduced her to the status of a strategic asset rather than a person with agency in determining her own fate. Elena's enhanced senses recoiled from the supernatural energies radiating from the council members, their presence creating a pressure in her mind that felt like being caught in the middle of a thunderstorm made of pure malevolence. The partial transformation that her pregnancy was triggering gave her just enough supernatural awareness to perceive the true extent of their power, while leaving her completely vulnerable to their influence. She could sense the layers of magical protection that surrounded them like armor, ancient wards and enchantments that made them nearly invulnerable to conventional weapons, while amplifying their natural vampire abilities to levels that defied comprehension. These were not merely immortal humans with enhanced strength and speed, but creatures who had transcended normal limitations through centuries of accumulated power and political maneuvering that had elevated them to positions of absolute authority within supernatural society. The demands that Lady Morgana presented were delivered with the casual certainty of someone accustomed to having her orders followed without question, her words outlining ultimatums that offered only the illusion of choice, while making clear that defiance would result in consequences extending far beyond Elena and Lucian's personal destruction. The pregnancy represented a violation of fundamental vampire law that threatened the carefully maintained balance between supernatural and human worlds, creating exposure risks that the ancient courts could not tolerate, regardless of the emotional attachments that had motivated the transgression. Elena listened with growing horror as the council outlined their preferred solution, a ritual, i.e., elimination that would remove both her and the child while leaving Lucian alive to serve as an example to others who might be tempted to follow similar paths of forbidden romance and reckless endangerment of their species' survival. The magical pressure in the room intensified as the confrontation reached its climax. Supernatural energies clashing between Lucian's territorial authority and the Council's ancient prerogatives in ways that made Elena's enhanced senses scream with overwhelm. She found herself caught between forces that could reshape reality according to their will, her human consciousness struggling to process magical conflicts that existed beyond normal perception, while her developing vampire abilities tried to interpret sensations for which she had no reference points or understanding. The very air seemed to crystallize with tension as centuries of vampire politics compressed into a single moment of decision that would determine not just her fate and Lucian's, but the future relationship between supernatural courts and the modern world they had learned to navigate through careful concealment and diplomatic manipulation. The confrontation ended as suddenly as it had begun, Lady Morgana and her companions dissolving back into shadows with the fluid grace of creatures who existed partially outside normal space-time, but their ultimatum hung in the air like a curse waiting to activate. Elena found herself alone with Lucian in the aftermath of supernatural politics that had reduced her to a strategic liability, her pregnancy transformed from personal crisis into existential threat to the vampire world's carefully maintained secrecy. The silence that followed their departure felt heavy with implications that neither she nor Lucian could fully articulate, the weight of ancient laws and modern consequences pressing down on them with the certainty of an approaching avalanche that would reshape the landscape of their lives in ways that no amount of planning or preparation could prevent. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. Lady Morgana's ultimatum hung in the frigid air of Lucian's office like a blade suspended over their necks, her words echoing with the authority of someone who had witnessed the rise and fall of empires and considered human civilizations to be fleeting entertainment between more serious supernatural pursuits. The blood severance was not merely execution, but erasure, a ritual so ancient and absolute that it would unmake Elena's existence on multiple planes of reality while simultaneously severing the magical bonds that connected her to their unborn child. Morgana described the ceremony with clinical detachment, her voice carrying the casual indifference of someone discussing the weather rather than the complete annihilation of two lives that had become inconvenient obstacles to vampire political stability. The ritual required Lucian's personal participation as the child's sire, forcing him to channel his own supernatural essence into the spell matrix that would unravel Elena's life force, while preventing the pregnancy from reaching term. It was designed as both punishment and lesson, demonstrating to the vampire courts that even their most powerful kings remained subject to ancient laws that place species survival above individual desire or emotional attachment. The 72-hour deadline was calculated with supernatural precision, allowing just enough time for Lucian to fully comprehend the consequences of defiance while preventing him from mounting any meaningful resistance to the Council's demands. Morgana's explanation of the political implications revealed the depth of opposition that their relationship had generated among the European courts, centuries-old factions that viewed human vampire breeding as the first step toward exposure and persecution that would destroy everything their species had built through careful concealment and strategic manipulation. The American territories had always been viewed with suspicion by the Old World councils, their relative youth and democratic tendencies threatening traditional hierarchies that had maintained vampire society for millennia. Lucian's relationship with Elena was being framed as evidence of American corruption, proof that New World vampires had grown too comfortable among humans and lost sight of the fundamental separation that ensured mutual survival. Elena watched Lucian's face during Morgana's pronouncement, her enhanced senses allowing her to perceive the emotional turmoil that his immortal composure couldn't quite conceal. 8 centuries of leadership had taught him to make impossible decisions with calculated ruthlessness. But this choice struck at the core of whatever humanity he had retained through his transformation and subsequent rise to power. His explanation of vampire political realities revealed a web of alliances and obligations that stretched across continents and centuries, agreements forged in blood that bound him to laws he had never questioned until Elena's pregnancy forced him to confront the true cost of absolute adherence to ancient traditions. No vampire king in recorded history had refused the blood severance when ordered by unanimous council decree, and such defiance would mark him as a traitor, not just to his own court, but to the entire species, making them both targets for hunting parties that would pursue them across the globe with supernatural persistence and unlimited resources. The journey to Lucian's private estate began in the pre-dawn darkness that preceded Sunday morning, his armored vehicle climbing mountain roads that wound through old-growth forests where cell phone signals died and GPS devices lost their connection to satellite networks that couldn't penetrate the supernatural wards protecting his sanctuary. Elena pressed her face against the bulletproof glass and watched the familiar lights of Seattle disappear behind them, replaced by wilderness that felt older and more primal than the civilized world they were leaving behind. Her enhanced senses picked up layers of magical protection woven through the landscape like invisible spiderwebs, ancient spells that would confuse human hikers and redirect government surveillance while providing early warning of any supernatural intrusion into Lucian's carefully guarded territory. The pregnancy was accelerating her transformation in ways that made every sensation overwhelming, her consciousness expanding to accommodate magical awareness that her human mind struggled to process and understand. The estate that emerged from the forest looked like something from an architectural magazine, all glass and steel and natural stone that seemed to grow from the mountainside itself rather than being imposed upon the landscape by human engineering. But Elena's supernatural senses revealed the truth beneath the modern facade. Layers of protective enchantments that made the entire structure into a fortress capable of withstanding both conventional assault and magical attack. The building had been designed by architects who understood supernatural requirements, with rooms that could be sealed against sunlight and corridors wide enough for inhuman movement speeds while maintaining the aesthetic appeal that would satisfy human guests who might visit during carefully orchestrated social events. Every surface was embedded with protective sigils disguised as decorative elements, ancient symbols that would channel defensive energies while appearing to be nothing more than artistic choices to untrained observers. Marcus emerged from the main entrance as their vehicle approached, and Elena's first glimpse of Lucian's oldest friend revealed another creature whose existence defied normal human understanding of age and mortality. He moved with the fluid grace of a professional fighter, combined with the casual confidence of someone who had survived countless battles across multiple centuries, his appearance suggesting a man in his early 40s, despite eyes that held the accumulated wisdom and weariness of truly ancient existence. His greeting to Lucian carried the easy familiarity of brothers who had shared too much history for formal politeness, but his assessment of Elena was thorough and calculating, supernatural senses evaluating her transformation progress and potential threat level with the efficiency of someone trained in protecting immortal aristocrats from dangers both mundane and magical. When he spoke, his voice carried traces of accents from languages that had been dead for centuries, but his English was flawless, and his understanding of their situation immediately apparent. The interior of the estate revealed itself gradually as Marcus led them through rooms designed for both comfort and defense, with furniture that could be moved quickly to create clear fighting spaces and artwork that concealed weapon caches behind innocent facades. Elena found her attention drawn to details that her human mind would have missed completely. Noticing how certain doorways were reinforced with materials that looked decorative but felt supernaturally strong. How windows that appeared normal actually featured glass thick enough to stop high-caliber ammunition, while filtering harmful wavelengths that might weaken vampire occupants. The library that served as their primary meeting space was lined with books in languages she couldn't identify alongside modern texts on subjects ranging from corporate law to advanced physics. The eclectic collection reflecting centuries of accumulated knowledge and adaptation to changing human societies. Marcus's explanation of the estate's defensive capabilities revealed the extent of planning that had gone into creating this sanctuary. Magical wards layered with technological security systems in ways that would confuse and misdirect any potential attackers, regardless of their supernatural or human nature. The protection spells had been woven by practitioners whose names appeared in legends rather than modern magical registers, ancient magicians who had bargained portions of their own life force to create barriers that would endure for centuries without maintenance or renewal. But even these formidable defenses were designed to delay rather than permanently repel the kind of coordinated assault that the vampire councils could mount if they chose to collect Lucian and Elena by force, rather than relying on political pressure and ultimatums to achieve their goals. Elena's transformation continued accelerating during their first day at the estate, her body adapting to supernatural pregnancy in ways that defied medical understanding and challenged her psychological adjustment to abilities she had never imagined possessing. Her strength increased hour by hour until she accidentally crushed a coffee mug in her grip, the ceramic disintegrating between her fingers with shocking ease that made her afraid to touch anything fragile or valuable. Her ability to sense supernatural presences expanded beyond the estate's boundaries, allowing her to perceive the magical landscape that surrounded them like a three-dimensional map overlaid on normal geography. She could feel the protective wards as warm currents in the air, sense the presence of wildlife that seemed somehow different from ordinary animals, and detect distant supernatural signatures that might represent threats or neutral parties moving through the territorial boundaries that Lucian maintained through treaties older than most human governments. The psychic connection between Elena and Lucian strengthened with each passing hour, creating a constant awareness of his emotional state that was both comforting and overwhelming in its intensity. She could sense his ancient grief at the impossible choice facing them, feel the weight of centuries spent balancing personal desire against political necessity, and perceive the depth of his attachment to her that transcended normal human understanding of love or commitment. The bond worked both ways, allowing him to monitor her physical and emotional condition while providing reassurance that her transformation was progressing within acceptable parameters despite the lack of historical precedent for their situation. Their conversations became increasingly telepathic, thoughts flowing between them with an ease that made verbal communication seem clumsy and inefficient by comparison. Research into vampire reproduction consumed their second day at the estate, Marcus providing access to texts and archives that revealed the tragic history of supernatural human breeding attempts across multiple centuries and cultures. Every documented case had ended in failure, with human mothers dying from the physiological stress of carrying vampire offspring, while the children either died with them or survived only long enough to demonstrate abilities that marked them as dangerous anomalies requiring immediate elimination. The pattern was consistent across different vampire bloodlines and human populations, suggesting fundamental incompatibilities that could not be overcome through medical intervention or magical assistance. Elena read account after account of women whose transformations had begun hopefully but ended in agonizing death, their bodies unable to complete the changes necessary to sustain supernatural pregnancy. But buried within the oldest texts were fragments of prophecy that suggested a different possible outcome, ancient predictions about a bridge-born heir who would unite supernatural and mortal worlds through bloodlines that transcended normal species boundaries. The prophecies were frustratingly vague, written in symbolic language that could be interpreted multiple ways, depending on the reader's perspective and assumptions about divine intervention in mortal affairs. Some versions suggested that the bridge-born child would appear during times of great supernatural crisis, serving as a catalyst for changes that would remake the relationship between hidden and visible worlds. Others implied that such a birth would signal the end of vampire secrecy and the beginning of open coexistence between species that had spent millennia learning to avoid each other. Marcus revealed additional complications as their research progressed, explaining that Elena's survival was only the first challenge they would face if they chose to defy the Council's ultimatum. The child growing inside her represented unprecedented magical potential that would attract attention from supernatural factions across the globe, many of whom would view such power as either an asset to be controlled or a threat to be eliminated before it could mature. Vampire politics operated according to principles that valued stability above all else, and a child capable of bridging species boundaries would disrupt carefully maintained power structures that had prevented supernatural civil wars for centuries. Even if Elena survived the pregnancy and birth, they would spend the rest of their lives protecting their child from those who would exploit or destroy abilities that had never existed before in recorded history. The weight of these revelations pressed down on Elena as she stood on the estate's observation deck, watching snow begin to fall across the mountainous landscape that surrounded their temporary sanctuary. The 72-hour deadline was approaching with inexorable certainty, each passing moment bringing them closer to a decision that would determine not just their own fate, but potentially the future of supernatural human relations across the entire planet. Her hand rested on her stomach, where their child continued developing at supernatural speed, already showing signs of the enhanced abilities that would make them a target, regardless of what choice Lucian made regarding the Council's ultimatum. The transformation taking place within her body was irreversible now, her human nature forever altered by magical forces that were preparing her to give birth to something that had never existed before. Whether that represented hope or catastrophe remained to be seen, but Elena felt the fierce protectiveness rising within her that transcended rational calculation of odds or political considerations about supernatural law and ancient traditions. Marcus waited until the third evening at the estate to reveal the secret he had been carrying for decades, his ancient eyes reflecting the firelight as he studied Elena with an intensity that made her newly awakened supernatural senses prickle with awareness of hidden knowledge finally coming to light. The revelation began with a photograph he retrieved from a locked safe, an image of Elena's grandmother, Isabella Martinez, standing beside a group of women whose faces radiated the kind of otherworldly beauty that marked practitioners of serious magical arts. Isabella's eyes in the photograph held depths that Elena recognized from her own reflection, the same luminous quality that had become more pronounced since her pregnancy began, and Marcus explained that her grandmother had been a hedge witch of considerable power who had deliberately severed her family's connection to the supernatural world through a binding ritual designed to protect future generations from the persecution that had claimed so many of their bloodline during the witch trials of previous centuries. The magical binding that Isabella had performed was intended to be permanent, layers of protective enchantment woven through bloodline genetics that would prevent her descendants from manifesting supernatural abilities, while simultaneously shielding them from detection by creatures who hunted those with magical heritage. But pregnancy had a way of awakening dormant powers regardless of the barriers placed against them, especially when the child being carried possessed supernatural nature that called to sleeping abilities within the mother's cellular structure. Elena's rapid adaptation to vampire pregnancy, her accelerated development of enhanced senses and supernatural awareness, her ability to perceive magical energies that should have been invisible to human consciousness, all were evidence that Isabella's protective spell was unraveling under the pressure of forces it had never been designed to contain. The implications of this revelation struck Elena like lightning, illuminating a landscape she had never suspected existed, her understanding of her own nature undergoing fundamental revision as Marcus explained the true significance of what was growing within her womb. Their child would not be merely vampire-human, an unprecedented but theoretically possible hybrid that might survive through careful medical intervention and magical support. Instead, they were carrying something far more extraordinary and dangerous, a vampire-witch-human combination that had never existed in recorded supernatural history and represented a convergence of magical bloodlines that could reshape the balance of power among all supernatural species. Witch magic operated according to principles that were fundamentally different from vampire abilities, drawing power from natural forces and elemental energies that vampires could manipulate but never truly command. And their child would inherit access to both magical systems simultaneously. Elena's hands moved instinctively to her stomach as Marcus described the potential abilities their child might possess, magical talents that would allow them to bridge not just the gap between supernatural and human worlds, but the ancient divisions that had kept different supernatural species separated and suspicious of each other for millennia. Witches and vampires had maintained uneasy coexistence for centuries, their magical systems incompatible enough to prevent direct conflict while remaining distinct enough to maintain separate political structures and territorial boundaries. A child capable of wielding both types of power would represent something entirely new in supernatural politics, a potential unifying force that could either bring unprecedented cooperation between species or trigger wars as different factions attempted to control or eliminate such dangerous potential. The awakening of Elena's witch heritage explained phenomena that had been mystifying even to Lucian's ancient understanding of supernatural physiology. Her ability to sense protective wards and perceive magical energies that normally required years of training to detect. The binding spell that her grandmother had created was designed to activate only under extreme circumstances, and the combination of vampire pregnancy with the life-threatening pressure from the European councils had provided exactly the kind of crisis that would trigger the protective enchantments to reverse themselves. Elena could feel the changes accelerating within her consciousness, layers of inherited knowledge beginning to surface from genetic memories that had been suppressed for decades, magical instincts that felt both foreign and utterly familiar, awakening in response to threats against her unborn child. Marcus revealed that he had recognized Elena's true heritage within hours of meeting her, his centuries of experience allowing him to perceive the magical potential that lay dormant within her bloodline, despite the powerful concealment spells that had hidden it from supernatural detection. His decision to conceal this information had been motivated by protective instincts rather than deception, understanding that knowledge of her witch ancestry would make Elena an even more valuable target for factions seeking to exploit or eliminate supernatural anomalies. But the approaching deadline for Morgana's ultimatum had forced his hand, revealing secrets that might provide the key to their survival, while simultaneously multiplying the dangers they would face, regardless of what decision Lucian made regarding the blood severance ritual. The strategic implications of Elena's magical heritage transformed their desperate situation from hopeless to merely impossible, providing theoretical possibilities for survival that had not existed when they believed her to be entirely human. Witch magic included protective rituals that could shield both mother and child during supernatural pregnancy, ancient ceremonies that had been developed specifically to allow magical bloodlines to continue, despite the dangers inherent in bearing children with enhanced abilities. But such rituals required knowledge and preparation that Elena did not possess, her grandmother's binding spell having prevented the transmission of magical education that normally passed from mother to daughter across generations of practitioners. She would need to learn centuries' worth of magical theory and practical application in a matter of days, mastering skills that typically required decades of careful study and gradual power development. The dawn attack came with devastating suddenness, Morgana's forces striking just as the first rays of sunlight began filtering through the mountain peaks in a coordinated assault that turned the Vampire Council's greatest weakness into a weapon against Lucian himself. Elena woke to the sound of shattering glass and Marcus shouting warnings in languages that predated written history, the estate's protective wards failing under magical assault that had been planned with military precision and centuries of tactical experience. Lucian's agonized roar echoed through the corridors as concentrated sunlight flooded areas that should have been safely darkened, forcing him to retreat to interior rooms, while Elena found herself alone and exposed in spaces that had been designed as sanctuary but were rapidly becoming death traps. The attacking vampires moved with inhuman speed and coordination, their assault teams equipped with weapons that channeled solar energy in ways that could burn vampire flesh while leaving human targets relatively unharmed. Elena's enhanced senses allowed her to track their movements through the estate, but her pregnant condition made physical escape impossible, even as her emerging magical abilities began responding to the life-threatening crisis with instinctive protections she had never learned to cast. Shields of crackling energy erupted around her as vampire soldiers closed in, ward constructions that should have required years of training manifesting spontaneously from genetic memories that her grandmother's blood had preserved despite decades of magical suppression. The battle raged through rooms that had been designed for peace and contemplation, priceless artwork destroyed by supernatural combat that reduced centuries of careful collection to collateral damage in a conflict over Elena's right to exist. She found Lucian trapped in the central hall where concentrated sunlight had been redirected through mirror systems that turned the space into a solar furnace, his vampire physiology forcing him to endure burning agony rather than abandon her to face the assault alone. Elena's protective instincts triggered magical responses that surprised even the attacking vampires, barrier spells that deflected their weapons while healing energies began repairing Lucian's solar burns faster than the artificial sunlight could inflict new damage. Marcus fought with the desperate fury of someone protecting family, rather than merely fulfilling professional obligations, his ancient combat skills allowing him to hold defensive positions that should have been overrun within minutes of the initial assault. But the attacking forces had been carefully chosen for this mission, vampire warriors whose ages and abilities matched his own, while their numbers provided overwhelming tactical advantage that no amount of individual skill could overcome indefinitely. Elena watched through supernatural senses as he was finally overwhelmed in the estate's armory, his capture rather than execution indicating that Morgana intended to use him as leverage in negotiations that would follow the successful completion of their primary mission. The escape from the estate required Elena to embrace magical abilities that felt both terrifyingly new and startlingly familiar. her witch heritage providing instinctive knowledge of concealment spells and transportation magic that allowed them to evade pursuit, despite the coordinated nature of the attack. She found herself weaving protections around Lucian that shielded him from further solar assault while creating illusions that confused vampire tracking abilities and misdirected their pursuers toward areas of the estate that had already been cleared. The magic flowed through her with increasing ease as her dormant abilities awakened fully under crisis pressure, genetic memories of her grandmother's training surfacing from bloodline inheritance that had been waiting decades for the proper circumstances to activate. Their flight through the Olympic wilderness tested both Elena's emerging magical abilities and her physical endurance, as pregnancy complications were exacerbated by the stress of supernatural combat and magical exertion. Lucian's condition was equally precarious, solar burns covering nearly 30% of his body, despite Elena's protective intervention, forcing them to seek shelter in caves and abandoned structures where healing could take place away from potential surveillance by Morgana's forces. The realization that Marcus had been captured rather than killed provided both hope and additional pressure, his survival dependent on their ability to negotiate from a position of strength, rather than the desperate weakness that had characterized their situation since the initial ultimatum. Elena's decision to abandon hiding and fight back came during their second night as fugitives, her analysis of their strategic situation revealing that continued flight would only delay inevitable capture while providing no opportunity for victory or even acceptable compromise. The vampire councils operated according to ancient traditions that valued secrecy above all other considerations, their entire power structure dependent on maintaining separation between supernatural and human worlds through careful concealment and political manipulation. But that very dependence on secrecy represented a vulnerability that could be exploited if Elena and Lucian were willing to abandon the protective invisibility that had shielded supernatural politics from human awareness for centuries. The plan that formed in Elena's mind was audacious to the point of apparent insanity, requiring them to expose vampire existence to human institutions while maintaining enough control over the revelation to prevent the panic and persecution that had driven supernatural species into hiding millennia before. Her emerging witch abilities included divination magic that allowed her to perceive probable outcomes of different strategic choices, and the glimpses of possible futures revealed that careful exposure might create more protection than continued concealment. Human governments and media organizations had resources that even ancient vampire councils could not directly control, and public awareness would make it impossible for Morgana to eliminate Elena and their child without triggering exactly the kind of supernatural exposure that vampire law was designed to prevent. The irony of the situation was not lost on Elena, as she explained her reasoning to Lucian during their temporary refuge in an abandoned ranger station deep in the national forest. The Vampire Council's greatest strength, their ability to operate in shadows and manipulate events from positions of hidden influence, could become their greatest weakness if Elena and Lucian were willing to drag their conflict into the light of human scrutiny. The pregnancy that had made Elena a target for elimination could become a symbol of supernatural human cooperation that would make her death politically impossible rather than strategically necessary. But such a plan required precise execution and careful management of information flow, revealing enough truth to provide protection while concealing details that might trigger the widespread panic and persecution that would threaten all supernatural species, regardless of their involvement in current political conflicts. Elena felt their child respond to her decision with movement that seemed approving, supernatural awareness already developing within the womb, suggesting that their offspring understood the stakes involved in this gamble, with forces that could reshape the relationship between hidden and visible worlds. The path forward would require Elena to embrace magical abilities she was only beginning to understand while navigating human institutions she had never intended to manipulate, all while protecting a pregnancy that was transforming her into something unprecedented in supernatural history. The witch heritage that her grandmother had tried so desperately to conceal might prove to be exactly the advantage they needed to survive conflict with forces that had never faced opposition from someone capable of wielding both ancient magic and modern media with equal effectiveness. Elena's fingers trembled as she typed the message that would irrevocably change the relationship between supernatural and human worlds. Her enhanced abilities, allowing her to perceive the ripple effects of each word choice across probability streams that stretched into an uncertain future. Sophia Chen's investigative journalist instincts had been piqued by Elena's cryptic request for a meeting at the abandoned waterfront warehouse where they had arranged to conduct their conversation away from surveillance networks that both human governments and supernatural courts maintained throughout Seattle's metropolitan area. The careful construction of their media strategy required revealing enough truth about Blackthorn Industries' unusual business practices to provide Elena and Lucian with protection through public exposure while concealing the full extent of vampire society that would trigger the panic and persecution that ancient laws were designed to prevent through absolute secrecy. Sophia arrived at the warehouse with the professional skepticism that had made her one of Seattle's most respected investigative reporters, but her expression shifted from casual interest to stunned amazement as Elena began explaining the supernatural context behind her sudden termination and the corporate conspiracy that had targeted her because of her relationship with Lucian Blackthorn. The story that Elena wove was carefully calibrated to sound like high-level corporate corruption rather than vampire politics. Describing Lucian as the victim of a hostile takeover attempt by European investment groups who were using personal scandals to undermine his control of Blackthorn Industries, while positioning Elena as a witness to financial irregularities that powerful interests wanted permanently silenced. The documentation that Elena provided had been carefully crafted, using her emerging magical abilities to create evidence that would satisfy journalistic scrutiny while supporting their narrative of corporate conspiracy and international intrigue. Lucian's centuries of business experience had taught him how to navigate human legal and financial systems with supernatural efficiency, and his knowledge of vampire politics allowed them to frame Morgana's ultimatum as the actions of rival business interests seeking to eliminate competition through intimidation and violence. The financial records that Sophia examined showed patterns of offshore funding and shell company manipulation that suggested the kind of sophisticated criminal enterprise that made for compelling investigative journalism while remaining safely within the bounds of human understanding. Sophia's questions grew increasingly probing as she sensed larger implications behind the story Elena was presenting, her reporter's instincts detecting layers of truth that extended beyond corporate conspiracy into territories that challenged conventional understanding of reality. Elena found herself walking a careful line between providing enough information to satisfy professional curiosity while avoiding revelations that would expose vampire society to scrutiny they were not prepared to handle. The pregnancy added urgency to their timeline that made careful information management even more critical. Elena's condition advancing at supernatural speed that would soon become impossible to conceal through normal explanations of human gestation. The media campaign that emerged from their collaboration was a masterpiece of misdirection that used truth as camouflage for larger secrets while providing Elena and Lucian with protection through public visibility that made their elimination politically impossible. Sophia's articles portrayed Lucian as a visionary businessman whose innovative approaches to sustainable development had attracted the attention of traditional European financial institutions that viewed his success as a threat to established power structures. Elena became the courageous whistleblower whose inside knowledge of Blackthorn Industries had made her a target for corporate assassins willing to use violence to protect their illegal activities from exposure. The response to Sophia's initial articles exceeded their most optimistic projections, with human rights organizations and business ethics groups rallying to support Elena's case, while demanding government investigation into the international conspiracy that appeared to be targeting American business leaders through personal intimidation and corporate espionage. The supernatural community watched with growing alarm as human institutions began focusing attention on vampire-controlled corporations and financial networks that had operated in careful secrecy for decades. Morgana's forces found themselves constrained by the very visibility that Elena's strategy had created, unable to take direct action against someone whose death would trigger exactly the kind of investigation that vampire law was designed to prevent. Elena's emerging magical abilities proved crucial to managing the complex information flows that their media strategy required, her divination talents allowing her to anticipate how different revelations would be received by both human and supernatural audiences, while her illusion magic helped create supporting evidence that would withstand scrutiny from investigative journalists and corporate lawyers. The witch heritage that her grandmother had tried so desperately to conceal became the key to navigating political complexities that would have been impossible for someone limited to purely human capabilities or traditional vampire powers. The binding ritual that Lucian proposed as their ultimate protection required preparation that pushed Elena's magical education to its absolute limits. Ancient ceremonies that had been designed for vampire-vampire unions and had never been attempted between species whose magical natures operated according to fundamentally different principles. The ritual would create unbreakable bonds between Elena and Lucian that would officially recognize her as Queen of the Northern Territories, while establishing their unborn child as legitimate heir to supernatural throne that carried authority extending across multiple states and several million human subjects who remained unaware of the vampire political structures that influenced their lives. Research into the binding ceremony revealed that its power came from the willing sacrifice of individual autonomy in favor of shared magical essence that would make attacking one partner equivalent to declaring war against both their combined supernatural authorities and their respective territorial holdings. For vampires, such bonds represented the highest form of political alliance possible within their hierarchical society, creating partnerships that transcended individual ambition in favor of dynastical power that could endure for centuries. But the ritual had never been performed between vampire and human participants, making Elena and Lucian's attempt an experiment that could either provide unprecedented protection or result in magical feedback that would kill them both. The ceremony required components that could only be obtained through supernatural channels that operated parallel to human commerce, rare minerals and magical artifacts that had been accumulated over centuries by practitioners whose names appeared in legends rather than modern magical directories. Elena found herself relying on abilities she was still learning to control as she prepared ritual circles and enchantment matrices, according to specifications that existed only in texts written by immortal magicians, whose understanding of supernatural law extended far beyond her current comprehension. Lucian's explanation of the political implications revealed that successful completion of the binding ritual would force Morgana and the European councils to recognize Elena's authority as legitimate vampire royalty, regardless of her human origins or the unprecedented nature of their union. Ancient treaties between vampire courts included provisions for dynastic marriages that created new territorial boundaries and spheres of influence. But those same agreements also contained clauses that could be interpreted as requiring the elimination of royal bloodlines that threatened established power structures. Their success would either create precedent for vampire-human cooperation or trigger conflicts that could reshape supernatural politics across multiple continents. Elena's pregnancy continued accelerating throughout their preparation for the binding ceremony, her body adapting to supernatural gestation timelines that compressed normal human development into a schedule that would see their child born within weeks rather than months. The combination of vampire and witch magical influences was creating unprecedented changes in her physiology that even Lucian's centuries of experience could not predict or control, forcing them to improvise medical support using magical techniques that had never been tested on someone with her unique combination of supernatural heritage and acquired vampire bonding. The ritual site that Lucian selected was located deep within the Cascade Mountains, at a location where natural magical energies converged in patterns that had been sacred to supernatural communities for millennia before European vampires arrived in North America. The preparation required them to travel through territory that was claimed by multiple supernatural species, negotiating safe passage agreements with werewolf packs and magical practitioners whose neutrality in vampire politics made them willing to provide temporary sanctuary for Elena and Lucian's unprecedented ceremony. Elena's emerging divination abilities revealed glimpses of possible futures that branched from their decision to attempt the binding ritual, probability streams that showed outcomes ranging from unparalleled success to catastrophic failure with very few neutral possibilities between the extremes. The magical energies required for the ceremony would either create bonds strong enough to protect them from any supernatural threat, or generate feedback powerful enough to unravel the protective spells that had been shielding their location from Morgana's forces since their escape from the estate. The night before the binding ritual, Elena stood at the edge of the prepared ceremonial space and felt their child respond to the magical energies that surrounded them with movements that suggested supernatural awareness far beyond normal fetal development. The pregnancy that had begun as an unexpected complication was transforming into something that could reshape the relationship between supernatural species and human civilization, creating a bridge between worlds that had spent millennia learning to coexist through careful separation. Her witch heritage provided instinctive understanding of the ceremony's requirements, while her vampire bonding gave her access to Lucian's centuries of political experience. But the success of their attempt would ultimately depend on magical forces that neither of them could fully control or predict. Lucian's final preparations for the ritual included contingency plans that would protect Elena and their child even if the ceremony failed and magical feedback destroyed his own supernatural essence. Sacrificial protocols that demonstrated the depth of his commitment to their survival, regardless of the personal cost. His explanation of these preparations revealed the true stakes of their attempt. The understanding that successful completion of the binding ritual would either provide them with unassailable protection or create magical conditions that would make their elimination necessary to prevent supernatural war between factions that had maintained uneasy peace for centuries. Elena felt the weight of centuries of supernatural law and political tradition pressing against their attempt to create something entirely new in vampire society. But her emerging magical abilities also revealed the potential for their success to establish precedents that could benefit supernatural human relations far beyond their individual survival. The child growing within her represented more than just the first vampire witch-human hybrid in recorded history. They were potentially the key to ending the secrecy and separation that had kept supernatural and human worlds apart since civilization began. The binding ritual would either provide the protection they needed to see that potential realized or ensure that their attempt to bridge species boundaries ended in the kind of spectacular failure that would serve as warning to others who might consider similar defiance of ancient laws and traditional power structures. The magical preparation required for the ceremony pushed Elena's newly awakened abilities to their absolute limits, her consciousness expanding to accommodate awareness of supernatural forces that operated beyond normal human perception, while her body adapted to channel energies that had never flowed through mortal vessels. The combination of her grandmother's witch heritage with Lucian's vampire bonding was creating unprecedented possibilities for magical manipulation and political authority. But those same powers also made her increasingly visible to supernatural factions who viewed such concentration of abilities as either valuable asset to be controlled or existential threat to be eliminated before it could mature into something beyond their ability to manage or contain. The convergence of vampire courts upon Seattle began 3 nights before the winter solstice, ancient powers descending upon the city with supernatural stealth that turned familiar landmarks into staging grounds for conflicts that would determine the future of species relations across the entire planet. Elena stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Space Needle's observation deck, her visibly pregnant form radiating magical energies that made the air itself shimmer with otherworldly light, while her enhanced senses tracked the arrival of immortal dignitaries whose combined age exceeded recorded human history. Lady Morgana's European delegation had claimed the Four Seasons as their headquarters, but representatives from African courts had established themselves in Pioneer Square, while Asian vampire lords commanded positions throughout the international district that provided strategic oversight of the supernatural battlefield that Seattle was rapidly becoming. Lucian's preparations for the formal challenge had transformed Blackthorn Industries into a fortress capable of withstanding both conventional assault and magical warfare. The building's upper floors, reconfigured to accommodate ancient ritual requirements, while maintaining the corporate facade that would prevent human authorities from investigating supernatural activities taking place within their jurisdiction. Elena's pregnancy had accelerated beyond all normal timelines during the weeks leading up to the confrontation, her body adapting to magical pressures that compressed gestation periods into schedules determined by supernatural development rather than human biology. The child growing within her womb demonstrated awareness that transcended normal fetal consciousness, responding to approaching supernatural presences with movements that suggested intelligence and magical ability that would manifest fully upon birth. The binding ceremony that would either legitimize Elena's position as vampire queen or result in their mutual destruction required preparation that pushed both her magical abilities and Lucian's political authority to their absolute limits. Ancient protocols adapted for circumstances that had never been contemplated by the immortal lawmakers who had codified vampire society centuries before human civilization achieved its current technological sophistication. Elena's witch heritage provided access to protective magic that complemented vampire ritual requirements, while her emerging divination abilities revealed probability streams that showed their success dependent on factors beyond their direct control, including the willingness of assembled court members to accept precedents that would fundamentally alter supernatural political structures across multiple continents. The penthouse showdown that would determine their fate began at midnight on the night of the winter solstice. Vampire courts assembling in Lucian's office with ceremonial protocols that honored traditions stretching back to the medieval period while acknowledging the modern context that made their gathering possible through global transportation and communication networks that their ancestors could never have imagined. Elena entered the transformed space wearing robes that combined elements of both vampire royal regalia and witch ceremonial dress, her appearance designed to emphasize the unprecedented nature of her position while demonstrating respect for both magical traditions that would merge during the binding ritual that represented their only hope for survival and legitimacy. Lady Morgana's presence dominated the assembled court with authority accumulated over 1,000 years of supernatural politics. But Elena's magical aura created pressures that forced even ancient vampires to acknowledge power that operated according to principles they had never encountered in previous territorial disputes or dynastic conflicts. The formal challenge to Lucian's rule proceeded according to ancient legal frameworks that required verbal testimony and magical demonstration rather than modern concepts of evidence or democratic process. Each court representative presenting arguments that revealed centuries of accumulated grievances against American vampire territories and their perceived departure from traditional values that had maintained species secrecy through careful separation from human society. Elena's participation in the proceedings surprised even Morgana, with demonstrations of magical ability that suggested training and experience far beyond what should have been possible for someone whose supernatural education had begun only weeks earlier. Her grandmother's genetic inheritance, providing access to spell matrices and protective enchantments that manifested with the precision of century-long practice, despite Elena's complete lack of formal instruction. The witch magic that flowed through her challenged vampire assumptions about magical hierarchy and territorial authority, creating protective barriers that deflected supernatural attacks, while generating healing energies that enhanced rather than conflicted with vampire physiology in ways that ancient texts had described as theoretical rather than practically achievable. The binding ritual itself became a spectacle that combined elements of royal wedding ceremony with magical demonstration powerful enough to reshape local reality according to supernatural law rather than physical limitations. Elena and Lucian's shared magical essence creating bonds that transcended individual identity while establishing their unborn child as heir to authorities that extended across both vampire territories and witch magical traditions. The ceremony required Elena to channel energies that would have destroyed purely human participants while allowing Lucian to share vampire capabilities through magical connection that created hybrid vigor rather than the species incompatibility that had historically made such unions impossible. The magical backlash that accompanied successful completion of the binding ritual revealed the true extent of their child's supernatural potential. Energies erupting from Elena's transformed physiology with enough force to shatter windows throughout the Blackthorn Industries building, while creating protective emanations that shielded assembled vampire courts from magical feedback that could have injured even immortal participants. The demonstration of power exceeded anything in recorded supernatural history, combining vampire strength and political authority, with witch magical manipulation and elemental control, in ways that suggested their offspring would possess abilities that transcended traditional species limitations and established entirely new categories of supernatural capability. Several court members responded to the magical display by offering formal submission to Elena's authority as legitimate vampire queen, their ancient instincts recognizing power that demanded respect regardless of the unprecedented circumstances that had created such concentrated supernatural ability. Lady Morgana herself acknowledged the binding ritual's success, with reluctant admiration that transformed her opposition from hostile challenge to careful political maneuvering designed to establish favorable relationships with the new royal dynasty that Elena and Lucien's union had created. The shift in supernatural politics was immediate and dramatic, centuries of established hierarchy reorganizing itself around the reality of Elena's position as the first human to achieve vampire royal status through magical rather than political means. Elena's labor began 3 months after the binding ceremony, her supernatural pregnancy reaching completion according to magical timelines that compressed normal human gestation into periods determined by her child's accelerated development rather than biological limitations that governed ordinary human reproduction. The birth itself took place in a specially prepared medical facility that combined state-of-the-art human technology with magical support systems designed to accommodate supernatural physiology while providing protection against complications that had historically made vampire human offspring impossible to deliver safely. Lucian's presence during the delivery provided magical stabilization through their binding bond, while Elena's witch abilities generated healing energies that supported her body through transformations that would have been fatal to purely human mothers. The twins that Elena delivered exceeded all expectations for supernatural hybrid vigor. Their combined magical potential representing evolutionary advancement that created new possibilities for species cooperation and political alliance across traditionally separated supernatural communities. The daughter bore Lucian's distinctive dark eyes combined with Elena's determined expression and fierce independence, while the son displayed Elena's warm brown eyes alongside an otherworldly presence that made even ancient vampires approach with respectful caution rather than the casual dominance they typically employed when dealing with younger supernatural beings. Both children demonstrated magical awareness from their first moments of life, their supernatural senses allowing them to perceive and interact with energies that transcended normal infant capabilities while maintaining the curiosity and emotional needs that marked them as fundamentally healthy despite their unprecedented genetic heritage. Elena's transformation through pregnancy and the binding ritual had fundamentally altered her relationship with both human and supernatural worlds. Her witch heritage fully awakened, while her vampire bonding provided access to immortal political networks and magical resources that created unique opportunities for bridging species boundaries that had seemed permanently established through centuries of careful separation. Her position as vampire queen came with responsibilities that extended far beyond personal survival to encompass the welfare of supernatural subjects whose existence depended on maintaining secrecy while adapting to modern circumstances that made traditional isolation increasingly difficult to maintain. The new laws that Elena and Lucian established in the wake of their successful binding ritual created frameworks for supernatural human cooperation that honored traditional requirements for secrecy while allowing carefully managed interaction between species whose mutual benefit had previously been limited by legal prohibitions against cross-species relationships. The legislation they implemented provided protection for supernatural human couples while establishing oversight mechanisms that would prevent the kind of exposure incidents that had historically triggered persecution and violence between communities whose coexistence required careful management of information flow and cultural exchange. Elena's role as CEO of Blackthorn Industries allowed her to implement cover programs that facilitated supernatural human cooperation through environmental research and medical development initiatives that provided legitimate explanations for activities that actually involved magical experimentation and cross-species collaboration designed to prepare both communities for eventual disclosure of supernatural existence. The corporate structure provided resources and legal protection that enabled gradual integration of supernatural knowledge into human scientific understanding, while maintaining plausible deniability that would prevent panic during transitional periods when both species learned to acknowledge their shared planetary residence 1 year after the binding ceremony. Elena stood in the renovated Blackthorn Industries boardroom that now served as both corporate headquarters and supernatural diplomatic center. Her dual role as CEO and vampire queen allowing her to coordinate activities that spanned both human business interests and supernatural territorial administration. Lucian's focus on diplomatic relations with international vampire courts provided stability for their territorial boundaries while allowing Elena to concentrate on domestic policy development that would create sustainable frameworks for supernatural human coexistence within their jurisdictional authority. The children thrived under care that combined human pediatric medicine with supernatural magical support. Their nursery protected by wards that drew from both vampire defensive traditions and Elena's grandmother's witch heritage to create security that would shield them from threats while allowing normal childhood development, despite their unprecedented magical capabilities. Their growth patterns suggested they would mature according to supernatural timelines while maintaining emotional and intellectual development that honored their human heritage, creating individuals capable of serving as bridges between worlds whose cooperation would determine the future of planetary civilization. Elena's journey from terminated executive assistant to supernatural royalty represented hope for transformation that transcended personal advancement to encompass species-level evolution in relationships that had been constrained by ancient fears and traditional limitations. Her success in navigating vampire politics while maintaining her essential humanity demonstrated possibilities for change that could benefit both supernatural and human communities through cooperation based on mutual respect rather than the careful avoidance that had characterized their interactions throughout recorded history. The love that had grown between Elena and Lucian proved that emotional connections could transcend species boundaries while creating new forms of political authority that honored both magical traditions and modern democratic principles, in ways that suggested optimistic possibilities for future development in interspecies relations and shared planetary stewardship.